Welcome everybody to today's economic psychology seminar. My name is Leonhard and it's my great pleasure to introduce Sunstein here today. Before I will do that, I will talk just a minute or so about the seminar series itself. A slide should come up right now where you can see that the seminar series is organized by the IAREP, the International Association for Research in Economic Psychology. This is very much closely linked to the Journal of Economic Psychology, which is going from strength to strength under Carlos and Eldad's editorship. We have a great lineup, and this is the second of our seminar speakers in this seminar series that you can see at the top right. And we have a conference. Unfortunately, the deadline has been last Friday, so maybe next year you can join us for the conference if you like the content of economic psychology. Now to the main event. We are really honored and grateful and very happy to have Professor Sunstein here. Professor Sunstein does not need an introduction for us, but I thought I just put a couple of books on the slide here, and here are a couple of books, and everybody might have a different take on the best books to pick. I thought these are really nice, with Nudge, and then going to The Ethics of Nudging, Why Nudge, going to Sludge and Simpler, going to #Republic, and very many different types of books, The World According to Star Wars. And then to the right of that, maybe something that's of most relevant for today. So I don't know what Professor Sunstein will be talking about, but maybe. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that he has written a lot of journal articles, but he also received some prizes. And this is maybe the outstanding one. That's the Holberg Prize that he received in 2018, which is the Nobel Prize for lawyers, as far as I'm informed. And this was 2018. And I just wanted to mention, because we are here at the Zoom license of University College Dublin, a year before 2018, 2017, Cass and Samantha Power received the Ulysses Medal, which is the highest honor that my university, UCD, can give to anybody. So just as a quick snippet of many different accolades, many different prizes, journal articles, and books written, but maybe most importantly as well for the real world is the policy influence, which is really massive. And we're really grateful and honored to have you here. And what I suggest for today is that you will speak, you said, about half an hour. We're happy to take questions in the Q&A with the Q&A system, and then you can upvote questions as well. And after the questions, we can unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. Or if you indicate that you'd rather have it that we will read out the question, maybe mention this in the question then. That's all I wanted to say, and it's a great honor and pleasure for us to have you here. Cass, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. The honor is mine. I'm not starting to cry, by the way. That was just a little frog in the throat. The honor is mine for two reasons. First, the Journal of Economic Psychology is fantastic, and I am an avid and grateful reader. Thank you for that. And second, that we're speaking today about my very favorite topic of all topics. This is the one I like best, and I hope that the foundational nature of the topic will be apparent as we speak. So let's start, shall we, with some literature. Sometimes the best economic psychologists are novelists and poets. And this is from a poem. The last lines will be familiar, but I'm hoping that you'll hear it as if it's new. This is a poem about young men who are being watched by the poet narrator, and they are in their youth and enthusiasm and carelessness, meaning not recklessness, but they don't have cares. They are inspiring. And then the poet steps back and understands that we're all mortal and writes, to each his sufferings, all are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, writes the poet, why should they know their fate? Since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies, thought would destroy their paradise. No more, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That's Thomas Gray, his ode on a distant prospect of Eton College. And that's the most, I think, searing plea for the bliss of ignorance in at least the English language. The second passage is from a novel called Possession by A.S. Byatt. And take this as the counterpoint, would you, to Ignorance is Bliss. And it's a letter in an incipient romance in which the poet, who is male, writes to the poet, which is female, the following, who is female, the following. And yes, this is a letter of seduction. The poet writes in a letter, I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things, once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending. Sorry about my dogs. My dogs are ruining the little letter. They're enthusiastic. Let me start again. I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done with what I never need have commenced on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable? That's a claim for wanting to know the end of a tale. The source of these remarks are several. When I was working in the United States government, we worked on a rule that ultimately required disclosure of calorie labels in chain restaurants and also in movie theaters. I argued hard for including movie theaters in the final rule with the thought that calorie labels would be valuable for people to know what they're eating when they're watching a movie. I sent to a friend a celebratory note when the final rule was issued, and I received a 3-word response from my friend. Cass ruined popcorn. Cass ruined popcorn. I found that a brilliant as well as deflating response because it was a suggestion that the emotional impact of receiving that information could be negative. As one is watching a movie, one might not want to think, I'm getting fat. That 3-word notation is probably the direct inspiration for these remarks. Less direct are 2 things. One, clarity, that information is all around us. Some of it is highly desirable and some isn't. Some of it is useful. Some of it ruins popcorn. And the question is, how should we think about the omnipresence of information? The final inspiration is my own policy role in government. When under President Obama, I was overseeing the regulatory process in the United States and heavily engaged with Europe as well. And I noticed enthusiasm for information disclosure policies without clarity about the welfare impacts of doing that. So if you give people a fuel economy label or some information about calories, or some information about whether food is genetically modified, or some information about people's own, let's say, risks and potential longevity, is that promoting their welfare? It's expensive sometimes. What are the welfare impacts? So this is where economic psychology meets data. Seeing the need for data, I've been involved for the past 6 or 7 years in a pretty reckless research project, and I'm going to tell you the current results. I describe it as reckless because I confess, when I started the research project, I didn't have a hypothesis in mind. I didn't know what hypothesis I was testing. I just wanted to know what people wanted to know. And the reason I wanted to know it is I was acutely curious about it, and hypothesis be damned. I just wanted to figure it out. I didn't even know if anything publishable would emerge. I just sought to find out. At this stage, we have data from 11 nations: Canada, Denmark, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Sweden. And the top line result is that for all their differences, in these nations at least, the desire to know and the desire to not to know look broadly comparable. They're not the same, but they're broadly comparable, and the differences are actually much less interesting than the relative, let's describe it, uniformity. And efforts to test to find demographic differences and other differences in what people ought to know have been, I think, thrillingly disappointing. That is, the demographic differences can be found. There are some, but they're modest and they're not that interesting. And I find that thrilling because it suggests a degree of uniformity across disparate persons with respect to what they want to know and don't want to know. Okay, I'm going to describe for you now in a, consider this a little like a football game in which I am the kicker and I'm just kicking balls at you all, the goalies, without any theory yet, though we're going to have one before terribly long. In at least one nation, it happens to be the United States, the data is going to look like what it is in other nations directionally. The differences, as noted, are modest. 43% of people want to know the calories in their meals for the next year. 43%. That suggests that 57% don't, and some number of them don't want their popcorn to be ruined. So I want the notion of ruining popcorn to be a metaphor for a desire not to know, or not a desire to know. Those would need to be separated, but at least we have either a desire not to know or not a desire to know among a majority. The big loser, the thing most people, the highest percentage of people all over the world don't want to know, is the year of their death. About 27% of people in this data want to know the year of their death. That's typical. People also don't want to know the year of death of their partner or spouse. 47% of people want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. A majority doesn't. That's interesting, significantly higher than year of their death, but most people don't want to know. If they're at serious risk of cancer, 58% of people want to know. A strong minority doesn't. Startlingly, or comically, about 42% of people want to know what their friends and family really think of them. Most people don't want to know what their friends and family think of them. More startling, maybe, 58% of people want to know whether the person for whom they have romantic feelings back for them. Only 58%. 42% don't want to know. Why is that? Well, remember, this is a reckless research project. I don't have a mechanism here. I hypothesize that some percentage of those 42% think it might be bad news and they don't want to hear the bad news. And some percent think that they'll get good news, but it's dangerous because they're kind of married. I have some data which is consistent with those hypotheses, which is I asked basically the same question. Do you want to know if the person for whom you have romantic feelings has romantic feelings for you? To about 40 Harvard undergraduates, and 39 of them said, absolutely, I want to know. Maybe they're optimistic, maybe they don't mind disappointing news, and certainly they're less likely to be married. They're younger. Only 42% of people want to know how much warmer the planet will be in 2100. 58% don't want to know that. Intriguingly, 57% of people want to know if their spouse or partner cheats on them. That's to suggest a very significant minority don't want that information. 53% of people want to know if there's a heaven. 44% of people want to know if there's a hell. For policy relevant choices, we typically get somewhere between half and 2/3 wanting the information. Calorie labels is an exception, where it's 43%. For safety ratings of tires, that's the highest I got. 67% of people want to know. 65% want to know the side effects of pain relievers. For conflict minerals, to use to finance mass atrocities, 55% want to know. That's morally inflected rather than personally relevant. That 55% a little lower than usually I get for consumer choices. 64% want to know the overuse charges, the magnitude of overuse charges on their cell phone. Okay, I hope you're thinking now that this is interesting, but I'd like to know the intensity of people's desire to know or not to know. And I have measurements of that also. When people want to know, typically they would be willing to pay somewhere between $30 and $70 to get the information. That's the rough magnitude, which is not trivial, but not massive. Interestingly, the contingent on wanting to know, the most intense desire, meaning the highest willingness to pay, is typically for the year of death. People don't want to know, but when people do want to know, they're willing to pay a fair bit for that information. For people who don't want the information, I wanted to know whether it's that they want not to know or they don't want to know, whether not knowing is a positive good or whether they just don't care. And it's frequently the case that contingent on not wanting to know, people are willing to pay something not to be told, but the amount is much lower than the amount they're willing to pay to get the information contingent on wanting to know. It tends to be between $5 and $15. It's highest, by the way, for year of your death. People are willing to pay a fair bit not to know that. Okay. Having collected all the data post hoc, I worked with others to try to develop a hypothesis that fits the data, not just mine, but an assortment of other data, a theory of the case, and I'm about to give you that, and then empirical test of whether the theory is correct. And the theory that seems to fit the data, though is not necessarily established by the data, has the following form. Consider this a hypothesis, which has been subsequently tested. The hypothesis is that people think first about the usefulness of the information, consistent with economic psychology, and here economic is in bold and psychology isn't. And the question is, what kind of instrumental value does information have? Now, information about the calories in your food might be useful if you're on a diet. It might be useless if you already know or don't care about your weight. And it might be of negative utility if it would have some adverse instrumental effect on your life. Now, the calorie label disclosure is unlikely to have a negative instrumental value, but if you are a doctor, to know whether your patient is a criminal might be a bad thing. And if you're a lawyer, to know whether your client is guilty might make it harder for you to do your job. And for a teacher, to know your course evaluations might be bad, because if they're bad, you'll kind of dislike your students possibly and teach less well. And I tell you that because not long ago, I was walking in the corridor at my university and noted with great enthusiasm that the course evaluations were out, to one of my colleagues who responded, "Oh, I never read my course evaluations." And when I asked him why, one of the reasons he gave is if they're bad, he's going to teach less well. So let's just note that there might be a positive instrumental value. To know the year of your death might be very valuable in terms of planning what's going to happen the next few years. To know the fuel economy of your car might be extremely valuable, to know how much you're going to pay and whether you should get a new car, etc. If there's no instrumental value, you won't want to pay anything along that dimension. And it might be, if it's negative, you'll pay something not to get the information. Okay, now let's put economic psychology with the psychology in bold and hammer on the ruined popcorn idea, and note that some people make a quick intuitive judgment about how the information would make them feel. and that can drive up or drive down willingness to pay to receive the information. That notion about the emotional impact of receiving the information fits comfortably with the data, where we typically get the lowest percentage of people wanting information when the information would make them sad or upset. And the year of your death or your spouse's death, even if it's quite good news, it's not a very good thing to think about. And the Alzheimer's and cancer numbers fit with that, as does a stream of data about people's desire to seek medical information in circumstances in which the news they get might be bad. Okay, so there's the positive emotional impact if you think you're going to get great news. There's the negative emotional impact if you think it's going to make you sad or frightened. And there's also the neutral possibility where you learn, for example, the side effects of the medicine for you, and that doesn't have a particular emotional impact, but it might be instrumentally very valuable. This, mind you, has what's the right word? Somewhere between important and crucial policy implications, because if people don't want information because it makes them upset, it might be that the information will have less impact because they'll avoid or try to dismiss it. Or it might be that they won't take corrective measures because they try to block it out of their minds. Okay, the third and final idea is that sometimes people seek information because it has cognitive value, independent of its instrumental and emotional impact. Sometimes people are just curious. So they might want to know whether Shakespeare really wrote Shakespeare's plays. They might want to know whether there's life on other planets, not because they want to protect themselves against invading aliens who purport to be in Chinese balloons, but they're actually from other planets, and not because they think that there's any value in terms of the emotions of receiving the information. They just want to know. I am acutely interested in whether dogs come from wolves. My co-author on some of these projects has absolutely no interest in that question, and that is suggestive that people have cognitive interest. Curiosity, I think, is not the right concept for reasons we can get into, but they seek to know something because it has cognitive value for them. Okay, now that's a testable hypothesis, and we've tested the hypothesis, and it turns out to be that the hypothesis is true. People do assess whether information is useful, how it makes them feel, and whether it relates to concepts they like to think about. They integrate these assessments into an assessment of the value of information, and that explains information seeking and its avoidance. Interestingly, different people assign different weights to the three factors, and they tend to be stable over time. Also, interestingly, people who assess larger weight to the cognitive motive show less psychopathology symptoms across the board. So people who give particular weight to the third of the three show reduced likelihood of depression and anxiety. Okay, I hope you're thinking right now that this sounds a little like Amos Tversky's work in psychology before he started co-authoring with Daniel Kahneman, or to put it another way, this sounds a little like Gary Becker, and meaning it's an irrational account, and that's a problem, and I agree with that. So we have data suggesting that the account just given, while established in terms of what people are motivated by, downplays the risk that people will be imperfectly rational in making judgments about what information to seek and what information to avoid. And let's just note three behavioral findings that are connected with information seeking and information avoidance, and which can lead to insufficient and excessive desire to know. The first is present bias. So we know for health-related information, people often don't want to know because they think it'll make them sad, and they discount heavily the long-term benefits of receiving information because it can make them sad and well. We also know that present bias in this context incorporates a hedonic forecasting error, that when people receive bad medical information, they think they're going to be distressed for a long time, but it turns out that they adjust pretty quickly. If people are unrealistically optimistic, that can lead to insufficient and excessive information seeking, that people might say, I don't need to get that information because I know everything's great, and it might involve health or economic well-being, or it might involve safety. It might be that people seek information in circumstances in which it's going to hit them really hard and have a negative hedonic effect, and they don't anticipate that. Availability bias, meaning risk perceptions that are driven by the sense of what's cognitively available, can lead also to insufficient and excessive information seeking. Okay, there's a great deal more work to be done on the dimension I just described. This fits the data, but exactly what the moving parts are for information seeking and information avoidance, we only have preliminary information. Also very important is to learn more about mental health and information seeking. Here's the state of the art right now. We know that avoidance of positive information is a phenomenon shown by people who have symptoms of depression. So depressed people avoid positive information. It's not clear they avoid negative information. That's extremely interesting, I think, and also concerning, because it's at least plausible to think that depression is amplified by simultaneous avoidance of positive information and non-avoidance of negative information. Suggests a potential spiral. It's also extremely interesting to think what we're going to do, what we should do about that. Anxiety, it looks like there is, from both induced anxiety and trait anxiety, a particular effect of information avoidance, which is that anxiety amplifies the tendency to seek information more in response to large changes in the environment. So when things are changing quickly, people who are anxious really want to find out information. Now, that might be parallel to depression. It might be an accelerator. Okay, I've noted, as well as noticed, I want to know that there are policy implications for this. And I told you that's the motivation for this work. And let me be a little more specific about that, which is that when the European Commission or some legislature or some regulatory body requires disclosure of, let's say, calories or fuel economy or energy efficiency or genetically modifiedness of genetically modified food, there's an analysis which ought to be done and frequently must be done of the costs and benefits. We might know without terrible difficulty what the costs are, but what are the benefits? There are 4 approaches that are taken, and let me just signal them and suggest here economic in bold, large font, and psychology present a little smaller, and suggest each of them has real problems. The first is to confess we just don't know, which signals in some regulators, let's say, a lack of sufficient desire to know in this meta-analysis of this unpromising approach. If you say we know the costs and we have no idea the benefits, that's not something to be proud of. To require people to disclose calorie labels or fuel economy labels without knowing whether people are benefited to any degree, that's not what governments ought to be doing. The second thing that's sometimes done is called break-even analysis, and this is familiar in some economic circles, where we assess what would the benefits have to be in order to justify the costs. And sometimes that's helpful, even if it has a modest, let's say, effect on public health to require calorie labels, even if the number of people who are interested is 43%, and even if the behavioral impact by the 43% is this, you might know that the relatively modest costs, let's be optimistic, are justified. Break-even analysis is a significant advance over despair before the epistemic challenge. The third thing, which the economically oriented people and the governments with which I'm familiar like best, is to calculate endpoints, to say that calorie labels will deliver this amount of benefit because we have data, either in a randomized trial or in some real world something that we trust, show that people consume fewer calories. That has the following benefits in terms of health. We can turn that into monetary equivalents, and then we've analyzed the benefits adequately. That's kind of the state-of-the-art view about what's best to do. But if the analysis thus far is right, it's not adequate because it doesn't include the hedonic loss of receiving the information or the cognitive cost of processing the information. Now, if we're lucky, the hedonic costs of the calorie label are modest, and the cognitive cost of having to think about it is also modest, but they're not zero, and we have to subtract them from the health benefits, and that's not being done. The fourth approach is to calculate willingness to pay to receive the information and to multiply the number of people times the average willingness to pay, and then we'd be in business. And some people are doing that. There are many challenges. If willingness to pay is infected by a behavioral bias, then it won't adequately capture the welfare impact. And it might be that there's a very challenging hedonic forecast that people have to make that's itself, by hypothesis, imperfectly informed. I suggest that what we ought to be aiming toward is an analysis of the subjective welfare consequences of the information, which would take on board principally the instrumental value and the hedonic value of receiving the information. Okay, I started with literature, and I'm going to end not quite with a poem or a novel, but with some words from a great philosopher from Cambridge University who died young. And here are the words which he wrote in response to Ludwig Wittgenstein, his mentor, and in some ways hero and nemesis. In time, the world will cool and everything will die, but that is a long way off still, and its present value at compound discount is almost nothing. The discount rate reference might give away that this is Frank Ramsey, I'm quoting, who died at 25, to make these words, I think, very moving. Nor is the present less valuable because the future will be blank. Humanity, which fills the foreground of my picture, I find interesting and on the whole admirable. I find, just now at least, the world a pleasant and exciting place. And now Ramsey goes hard at Wittgenstein. You may find it depressing. I am sorry for you, and you despise me. But I have reason and you have none. You would only have a reason for despising me if your feeling corresponded to the fact in a way mine didn't. Now Ramsey is going after Wittgenstein's Tractatus from the standpoint of pragmatism. But neither can correspond to the fact. The fact is not in itself good or bad. It is just that it thrills me, but depresses you. On the other hand, and here's Ramsey bringing the point home, I pity you with reason because it is pleasanter to be thrilled than to be depressed, and not merely pleasanter, but better for all of one's activities. So saith Frank Ramsey, and I am urging, this is the beating heart of what you've heard, close attention to the emotional impact of having or not having information. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cass. That was brilliant. You have to imagine a round of applause here with the webinar function. I don't think we can see the applause, so I thought it was really fascinating. We have a first question from Guylaine, or somehow similar. So I will allow you to talk if you don't mind. And you had two questions, and if you want to go one question after the other, first the first question and then the second one.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this brilliant talk. So I wonder, for the first question, what the target population in all these countries were, whether the population was kind of representative of the country's population. And maybe my question is, maybe it's a little away from what you talked today. I wonder, when does information disclosure can be considered as a nudge? Or put it in another way, is what the fundamental difference between nudge and a government communication? Thank you.
I really want to know those questions, but I couldn't quite hear them.
So I think the first one is whether your target population was representative of the population in those countries. And the second one is what would be the difference between a nudge and government communication?
Okay, so on nudge versus government communication, a nudge is an intervention that preserves freedom of choice, but steers people's decisions in directions that make their lives go better by their own lights. If the government says things are going well in the economy, that's not a nudge, it's a government communication. If the government says, wear a mask under conditions in which, let's stipulate, mask wearing is a good thing, that would be in the nature of a nudge. So there are government communications that are nudges, but most of them aren't. So if you look at what Denmark's government said in the last year, the percentage that are nudges would be very small. If the question was were the samples nationally representative? Yes, absolutely. So in the 11 countries, we had nationally representative samples. I gave you, just for simplicity, the results of a pilot study in the United States, which was not nationally representative, but the numbers are very close to what we obtained in the United States with a nationally representative sample.
We have another question that is quite detailed, I believe, about the survey design. So we see Antonio Philippin. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm referring to a literature about something like finite pool of worries, something like that. And if I have a good recollection, that says something like subjects tend to have problems dealing with many dimensions of unpleasant consequences, so many beds at the same time, for instance. So I wonder whether the fraction of people willing to receive information might be affected if you ask about several negative consequences. And if you did so, if maybe there can be like a decreasing pattern of people wanting to receive information as this receive subsequent questions about possibly negative information.
Sure. So that's a testable hypothesis, and I like the hypothesis. So if you told people, if you receive information about, you know, a medical risk that you face, let's say you receive information that something's not going so well with your heart. If you receive information suggesting one consequence of that could be greater stress, which could aggravate your heart problem, then people will be less likely to receive it. So you could easily prime negative impacts in a way that would skew people's judgment. If you told people that if you receive calorie information, you won't enjoy your meals as much, and you might compensate by eating a lot of snacks, high calorie snacks at home, then people might think, you know, let's not get that calorie information. So that would be easy to nudge people in a fiendish way, or in a, you know, a beneficial way to receive or not to receive information. Your question has more in it than I've been able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we go to IAREP's president, Vera Rita.
Okay, many thanks. Many thanks for joining us, Professor Sunstein. It's a great pleasure for us. And again, it's another very interesting talk that you've offered us. My question is, would you think of any strategies that could be used by policymakers to help people get more used to unpleasant news? I mean, to go beyond confirmation bias, to go beyond the effective heuristic, and sort of grow up to be an adult and have to face unpleasant information. It's a tough one, but thank you very much.
Yes, it's a great question. So say if you're a policymaker, as I've been occasionally for my sins, to give people a sense that they can do something about the risk, reduces the negative impact of learning about the risk and turns fear into hope. So if you know the reason people don't want the information is they're focused on the sadness or extreme case despair that the information gives them, then tell them it's okay. Here's what you can do. So people who receive negative health information often feel much less terrible than they expected. Partly that's because of adaptation. But in many cases, it's because people learn, well, you take a medicine every morning or eat healthier. And there's data suggesting if you give people bad information, but give them, meaning something that upsets them, but give them a phone number they can call to get help, that really works. I just saw, by the way, yesterday on television, something that is directly responsive to your question about a professional tennis player who faced crippling anxiety. He actually had to quit. His name was Marty Fish. He was playing Roger Federer in the quarterfinals of a big tournament. He couldn't show up. He just stopped. And several years later, he had a big public press conference, which became a television show yesterday, in which he described his struggles with anxiety. And you could see he was doing it, saying, I got help, you should too.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have an anonymous attendee, so I might just read out the question. This two-parter. As some people prefer knowing, doesn't a considerable amount of hedonic cost balance out in a more general, on a more general policy level?
Okay, let's talk about some data that is supportive of the empirical premise of the question, but not supportive of the happy conclusion. This is from Linda Thunstrom, a terrific economist, psychologist, as I think of her, who finds for calorie labels, most people want them and they're willing to pay something for them. A strong minority doesn't want them. The people who want them alter in a pretty realistic setting their consumption choices once they receive the calorie label. The people who don't want them don't alter their eating patterns after they receive the calorie label. So then the question is, are the calorie labels on imaginable assumptions a good idea because the people who want them, people who don't want them, balance out? Maybe, but here's a possible reading of the data, which is the people who want the data don't really need it because they don't have self-control problems and they're glad to have the labels, and then they eat salad rather than hamburger, but they're not benefiting much from that. And the people who need the calorie labels, who have self-control problems, keep eating the high-calorie foods and are upset and sad. So the balance out will undoubtedly sometimes happen, but if the losers lose more than the gainers gain along relevant dimensions, then there's a welfare loss. I hasten to add that I don't think that's the right reading of Thunstrom's particular data. I think her data suggests a net welfare gain, but it's a lower net welfare gain than we would have expected. And in the population that the calorie labels are supposed to benefit, there's a welfare loss.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I asked the second part of the question particular because I personally think it's so interesting. It touches on paternalism, I believe. So secondly, it could be that people don't want to know, but they should know, trading the smaller hedonic cost for a higher benefit in the future. So what would be your idea there?
I agree with that. So the word paternalism is something that some people recoil from as if they heard the word, Satan or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good that people do that because it's promotes freedom. But let's call it the anti-paternalist heuristic, which is generally good but leads to severe and systematic errors. And so I agree in the context that there's imaginable provision of information in circumstances in which it's welfare promoting, even if people say, please, please don't tell me, I'm blocking my ears.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Carlos, you had the question as well.
Yes, it's more a curiosity question. I mean, you're touching on self-control, but you told us about several factors influencing when you do not want to know. But going to a bit more primitive classification, the questions that you mentioned, there are at least two big kinds. I mean, the questions of not wanting to ruin popcorn for you, those are maybe related to self-control at a very basic level. But then questions like, I don't like the consequences of who I would become or how I would behave if I knew that, knowing the opinion of others, knowing your evaluations, even knowing the year of your death. I mean, capital T effect is a very real thing. Those really involve a degree of self-knowledge of your image, which is absolutely staggering. So do you think that for those questions, we limited the research question for that kind of question, that there are going to be interactions with your self-image, things like lay rationality and so on?
No, that's great. And it has both policy implications and deep psychological implications. So notice if someone doesn't want information that will make them feel sad, it might be a self-control problem, but it might be just a sense that'll make my days worse. And I don't want that without having a self-control problem. So this Zoom has a feature where it makes me look like I've lost some hair. And I just know I haven't lost any hair. And if I believed the Zoom, I'd be sad. Of course, this is a ridiculous example, but some people don't want to know things. And you're putting a finger on the self-image problem, which is really good and very important. And that's true. And then what to think about that. So if people have a self-image as, let's say, strong and confident or articulate, and then they learn that those three things aren't quite right, they might not want to hear it, and they might try not to believe it. Even that's the motivated reasoning point, confirmation bias, and also motivated reasoning. And that's, I think there's a paper, maybe you're a co-author of self-image, a terrific paper on self-image and information avoidance. And that's undoubtedly true. It might be the most fundamental of all. It might be a deeper level to explain hedonic impact. It wouldn't be the whole thing, because if people don't want to know when their partner's going to die, it wouldn't be about self-image. It would be about devastation or something. And what I find so interesting about that data is you could learn that your partner's not going to die until, let's say, she's 98. So you could get really good news. But I think no one wants to know, or that's too strong. A lot of people don't want to know any date that their partner's going to die, because they don't want to know that's going to happen. Even though they do in some sense, no one's immortal.
Thank you.
That is interesting. The self-image question I'm hoping we have an amazing audience here in terms of expertise in numbers to test the relationship between preferred self-image and information avoidance and information seeking. There's a little of that, but not nearly enough.
Okay, everybody, hope everybody listened to this. Pedro Gonzalez Fernandez, you have raised your hand. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I was also thinking in the realm of policy making and these surveys that you have conducted in several countries. And I was wondering about information avoidance and thinking how volatile these percentages are over time, right? Because I can imagine that these varies a lot from question to question. So for example, in the calorie example, I can also imagine that this is even seasonal, right? If you ask people during Christmas, they probably don't want to know, but if you ask them more towards summer, then they maybe want to know a bit more. So in terms of policy making, is this a concern depending on the question at hand? Thank you.
That's great. So okay, so we have a testable hypothesis, which is there's volatility with respect to information seeking and information avoidance. I have a contrary hypothesis, which isn't subtle, which is there isn't much volatility. We can test that. The data we have doesn't answer the question, but it's consistent with the modest volatility point in the sense that the studies that have been done at different times don't show dramatic differences, but they're crude. We haven't tested calorie labels right before beach season and calorie labels right before Christmas. It'd be interesting. I have a by the way, I hold my hypothesis very tentatively, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's wrong. But if it turns out to be right, I have a mechanism by which the contrary hypothesis has intuitive appeal, which is when we think before summer, even as researchers, how do I look on the beach is the question that summer calorie labels prime, and Christmas, the question is happy time, eating time. I don't care how I'm going to look on the beach. And my hunch is that that heuristic misfires, that when people are thinking, do I want a calorie label? They're thinking, do I get information I need? Is it going to make me enjoy my meals less? And so the contrary hypothesis suggests the instability would be, there wouldn't be none. There would be at least one person who'd want a calorie label on the planet, who'd want a calorie label in May, but not Christmas. Probably at least 100, at least 10,000. But would it change the population-wide numbers? We should find out.
Right, thank you.
Another a good one, yeah. I follow up with maybe Dave Comerford's question that he asked me to read out, and is about which is your preferred method of valuing the welfare consequences of information provision?
Thank you. I'd want, my preferred method would be to measure subjective welfare, and there's efforts to do that, but none is good enough for government work. My preferred second choice would be willingness to pay, but with fear and trembling. It's the best we've got.
Yeah, that was my question, because philosophically, one is based on choice, willingness to pay, and the other one is a mental states account. They're very different philosophies underlying both of them, but you would jump in between for pragmatic reasons. Is that the main one?
The mental state account is the right one. So if people, let's say, are a tiny bit sadder, but much healthier, mental state wouldn't be the only thing we care about. It would be welfare. And if they live longer lives or something, but they don't enjoy their meals quite as much, that might be fine. It might be also that people ex ante think they're going to be sad and switch to salad and enjoy the meal less. But it might also be they start to like salad a lot and start to think of the high calorie foods as kind of terrible as an association. So the welfare question would be the right one. But doing nothing is, of course, not the right. And they're saying we have no idea. Break-even analysis is desperate, though better. Endpoints don't tell us everything we need to know, so willingness to pay is better. I say with fear and trembling because it has, all the problems we discussed. It should capture the mental state, willingness to pay. It does, but it won't capture many things, including it will embed what will for many be a prediction error.
Yeah, very interesting. Carlos, do you wanted to follow up there?
Yes, I'm not so sure that it's a follow-up on that, but I mean, when we are talking about the policy implications and policy measurements, I mean, there's a very big topic, which is information about your health. And information about your health has aggregate consequences, because if I fail to take a certain test because I don't want to know, I fear the result, then I might become a burden on the health system, which is not necessary. There have been some arguments, but I don't think in academic circles that potentially one could separate these things and have, in a more organized society, medical checks where the information is not necessarily disclosed unless there is a need. Of course, it's very limited. I'm curious to what your views in that particular domain would be.
You're right, there's an externality. So if information disclosure avoids significant costs for the public, then that's part of the overall assessment. I'll tell you a story and then I'll tell you a wrinkle. So I have a friend actually who told me within the last month that she was told by her doctor she has a tiny, tiny risk of having a terrible medical condition, tiny risk. And it's incurable. So if you get it, it's catastrophic news. Question was whether she wanted to test or be tested for it. Interesting, yes? Many people under those circumstances would say, I don't want that test because it can only be horrifying and it's probably going to be fine. So there's that. Now take your point that let's suppose that people similarly situated could protect themselves. Not true in this case, but could protect themselves. And the healthcare system faces a burden. There's some research suggesting, this is very provocative research, I think more for moral reasons than for empirical reasons, suggesting that smokers actually save the health system money because they die decades earlier. And the externalities, the economic externality is actually, it's a positive externality for the public. Now, let's just stipulate that it's true that some people who die young save the taxpayers' money. Then we don't have a negative externality.
Carlos, I based on the time, I will just now assume that you're fine with the answer.
Yes, thank you.
Giuseppe, you unraised your hand. Do you want to speak now for your question?
Okay, I will ask. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes, very good.
Okay. My question would be how better measure deliberate ignorance. I faced myself this question as I've tried to capture this phenomenon concerning COVID. So I tried with willingness to pay. I tried, there are some information avoidance scale, but again, I don't think we still have a method that really capture well this. I'm thinking now of using perhaps choice experiments that are based on regret-based type of utility, but so I would ask Professor Sunstein if there is any promising way of measuring that in his experience. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So I was at the University of Chicago for over 2 decades, and willingness to pay is in the water. So I don't hate that, willingness to pay as a way of measuring deliberate ignorance. it's a measure of how, whether and with what intensity people want to know or don't want to know. So for that purpose, I think it's pretty good, and I'm not sure anything's better. The problem is that people might make mistakes where they say they're willing to pay nothing to receive information, which could make their lives much better. So it might be there's a psychological reason why willingness to pay is zero or really low, even though the welfare benefits of receiving it for the agent are really high. So I have a paper with Paul Dolan, which tries to use facial recognition as a way of capturing the short-term emotional impact of receiving information. That's what's happening in the face, and that captures something. It's not everything. Ultimately, we'd want to do a full spectrum assessment of the welfare effects, and we want to go at that directly. Willingness to pay is a way of capturing it ex ante. But if you have a calorie label in Berlin and people after a year are much healthier and enjoying their meals as much, then hooray, even if ex ante only 43% of people wanted it, and the willingness to pay was low, and the willingness to pay not to get the information was higher.
That's brilliant. We're just behind the hour, but for the whole community, it's really fascinating to see these things like self-image as a main determinant of information seeking, or the methodological questions, how to best measure these. So really, you showed us many different ways how we can do really good economic psychology research that's relevant for policy and so on. In the name of everybody in the audience at IAREP, thanks a lot. A big round of applause. That was really brilliant. We appreciate that very much. And again, thank you, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks to you. I loved it. Thanks to the audience.
One last comment to everybody. The deadline for abstract submission for our conference has been extended to 25 of February, so you still have a little bit of time. Thank you.